All right, looks like that's finally working. All right, what is going on, everybody? It's 9:30, so let's get this train wreck of a day going, shall we? I got some folks in the class with me today, so I'm going to be wearing my mask for the lecture. Hopefully you guys will be able to hear me okay with the microphone. If you're having any trouble, just let me know. So today we're wrapping up week 9, and today we're talking about the social characteristics of urbanization. So for today, a couple of quick announcements and then a pretty standard looking day. And then the activity for today is we'll take another round of building consensus towards our final exam. So again, just the same announcement from Tuesday. The Udall Foundation is awarding a scholarship. If you are a sophomore or a junior undergraduate right now, they have a webinar coming up on October 23rd, which is Friday next week. From 3 to 4. So the Zoom link is on the PDF copy of the PowerPoint, which I did not have time to post today. So I apologize if the PDF is not there for you right now. I'll have that after class. So I sent out, well, I didn't send out this part. So on Tuesday, we talked about the alpha delta, giving positive feedback for the course and areas for opportunity through the Google Forms option. And so I went in and did some analysis on the feedback results. And so far, the top 2 words for the alpha side were feedback. And so most of you overwhelmingly enjoyed feedback on assignments. And so I will, of course, keep doing that. And then the option of choice. So how to watch the class, engage in the class. So having that option of doing it online or face-to-face was the second top result. And then what should I keep doing in this course? Overwhelmingly giving feedback on assignments in the way that I have been, and if possible, trying to be more detailed. So I will keep doing that as well. So for the delta results, the biggest problem so far that most of you identified was motivation. So the motivation to read the assignments, to actually engage in the class, get up, watch the live stream rather than watching it later. And so the top 2 adjustments that were recommended to try to take on this delta was to try to take notes. And so I thought that was interesting because the statement that followed that was basically trying to simulate the real face-to-face class as much as possible. And so the other one was also change environments. And so a lot of you had made note that it's really hard to stay motivated right now because basically your living space, your academic space, your everything space is kind of the same 4 walls, so to speak. So some of you had made the suggestion of trying to tackle this by trying to make a little space where you're at just for where you do your school stuff, and then dedicate some more space to just the normal everyday life. And so I think those are some good strategies. You guys have certainly heard me talk about it before, that it's hard, even for me being in my little home office with my kids and trying to do work and consult and et cetera, et cetera. So I think those are great recommendations for adjustments to make. So if you would like to participate in this survey, just a reminder that the midterm feedback is still available in week 9. So if you were to check that out, you can still participate in the midpoint review of the class. Again, I do use all of this feedback and build it directly into the course for the last half of the class and in future offerings of the class. So if you're interested in participating, please do. So opening circle question for today. What is a city? So we've been talking for the last, well, going on 9 weeks now about urbanism, about living in cities. But what is a city? So if you had to think of one word right now to describe what it is, what a city is, what do you think that word is? And those of you joining us virtually, please use the chat. Got any ideas, Caleb?
High-rises.
High-rises? Okay. So if we were to describe a city or ask even what is a city, one suggestion is the idea that high-rises make a city. For those of you who have been here in Albuquerque your whole life and have gone to other cities, and of course those of you that are here now, if you've ever wondered why Albuquerque doesn't have any taller buildings than what we already have, It's because we're here in the Rio Grande River Valley, and the bedrock that is downtown is only stable enough or hard enough to actually support buildings the size that we have right now. So we could go a little bit taller. There has been a building that was approved that I think is no longer in the process. But that's why we actually can't build any higher than what we do already here in Albuquerque. No suggestions for the chat, so that's okay. Hang on to this question, it will come back around. So if we had to describe the city or kind of figure out what a city is, there's really two things that we're primarily talking about. One is urbanization, and the other is urbanism. And so essentially what we're trying to say here is that the city itself is two things. It's the built environment, so the city's physical form, but it's also the culture of the city. So it's urbanism, the process of living in the city, of experiencing the city. And so that's why, again, this class is taking a look at the social challenges of urban and regional development, because those two things are intertwined in our city lives. So taking a look at these two things, when we start to describe a city or try to define a city or explaining to family who may live in a small town somewhere what it's like living in a city, the three most common things is we fall down to is who inhabits the city. One thing that I've said time over time is that one of the really positive effects that occurred here in New Mexico as a result of Hurricane Katrina and the bigger hurricanes that devastated the South, and of course affected a lot of people. One of the really positive things that has actually made New Mexico more diverse. We now have a higher percentage of African American and other Creole and other populations, which are only typically more in the South statistically. And so you take a really negative event and actually find some positive in it, because it's actually made New Mexico more diverse. And so being here in the city, it's something that I really enjoy. So who inhabits the city? How do their lives differ from small rural towns, right? So if you have your family back home in a smaller city or even a bigger city, and you're trying to describe what it's like to live here, you'll often compare and contrast how our lives differ from small rural towns. And so how do we actually describe urbanism and urbanization if we're trying to encapsulate the city itself? Well, for the next couple of weeks, when we talk about urbanization and the city and what city planners actually do, this is what we're going to start to dive into a little bit more. And so we're really going to talk about how the population size of a city really affects the city itself. In the 2010 census, Albuquerque, the greater metro area, so Albuquerque, Rio Rancho, Corrales, this whole area called the metro region, was about 1.1 million. And then a few years later, after Intel started to go fully automated, some other changes occurred, the housing bubble happened, we were down to only about 850,000. So the metro area as a whole lost quite a bit of population. And so we'll talk about that and how population size really affects the city. We're going to take a look at human settlement patterns, why people actually use the area the way that they do, how they structure their cities. How do you economically develop a city? Why is it that certain areas why are rents so much higher? Why are housing more affordable or less affordable? So we'll take a look at the economic development of the city and how planners engage in that process. Also the social classes. Why is it that we have gated communities? Why is it that we have certain places like Tanawan here in Albuquerque where people live in walled communities where there's only a handful of entrances with a security guard, and they actually pay for their own streets. And so when the asphalt is repaired and put down, that's not done by the city, the community actually pays for that. So why do we have stuff like that? And then we have inequality, say in the South Valley, where there's certain parts of the city that don't even have sidewalks. And you have people with needs trying to catch a bus in a sandy spot. So we'll talk about that, how planners take on that one. We'll dive into zoning, why zoning is so important and what it is. And then also the characterization of the city. So Why is it that we refer to the southeast part of Albuquerque as the war zone? Why is it that we made an attempt to rebrand that part of town as the international district? So what is it that we're trying to create there through this social organization and social disorganization? So when we're describing urbanization, what is a city? That's what we're going to start diving into. But it's also the process of urbanism. So if urbanism is the culture of the city, the actual life that you live in the city, we usually refer to urbanism under this guise of civilization, right? And so what is civilization typically represents? Well, it typically represents progress. So that is an interesting marker because progress towards what or away from what? How do we even measure progress as a process of urbanism? And the energy of the city, right? So they say New York is the city that never sleeps. What is the energy around that? Why is it that we give that designation to a city like New York when other cities are more energetic? And then, of course, what are the collective social values? And so if you live in the city of Albuquerque, can you pick up and drop yourself in the city of Santa Monica and be the exact same person, the exact same cultural experience in this process of urbanism? And so we'll kind of dive into those two aspects as well. And so what is a city? When I ask you to come up with a certain word to describe this, what we're trying to do is we're trying to associate the built environment with what we experience as the process of living in the city. So when we describe urbanism, we usually talk about the pace of life, the feelings that certain areas have. You may really enjoy going into downtown at night because the feeling of being downtown in a slightly urban environment maybe makes you feel like home just a little bit, whereas some people may be in that exact same space, that exact same time of day, and be terrified that something is going to happen to them. When we describe urbanism, it's often associated with materialism. So do you have a Mac? Do you have the latest iPhone? There's certain products that you can own that associate you with the process of living in an urban environment and experiencing urbanism. If you lived down in the Bosque Farms area, for example, a very small community, and you walk into someone's house and they have one of those Samsung fridges with the touch screens, does that really match what you think that community is? And so materialism is often associated with urbanism. And of course, the idea of individualism. So we've touched on this before, where essentially you can be somebody living in the city, be a complete individual, living your own life, and yet surrounded constantly by other people also navigating their own individualism, and yet you're in this large social environment. And so describing urbanism as you live it is usually also associated with that. And of course, through the world of planning, we often talk about the walkability of the urban environment, the traffic mobility, things of that nature. And so let's dive into some of these ideas where people in the past have also tried to encapsulate this idea of what is a city. And so the first person we're going to start with is Lewis Wirth. He was an American sociologist who passed away back in '52. And he wrote what is arguably the most influential essay on the urban sociology. And the title of his publication was Urbanism as a Way of Life. And so he gets credit with coming up with the idea of the urban sociology and coins the term urbanism. And so what Lewis is coming up with is the idea that urbanism as a way of life, when you are engaged in urbanism, it's a direct reflection of how you dress, how you speak. So the way that I dress here before you today, living in a city, is this the same way that I would dress and look if I were to go back to my small indigenous community up in Minnesota? So being in an urban environment and living the process of urbanism is reflected by how we dress and speak. We collectively believe how the city should operate. So here in Albuquerque, we believe that Route 66 should be preserved. The Camino del Real going, the original Spanish conquistador road that went from Mexico City up to Santa Fe, that's something that we believe that should continue to operate in some form or fashion. What's worth achieving? So here in Albuquerque or in any city, right? What's worth putting our tax dollars into? What's worth achieving as somebody living in this city, right? So if you're living in Las Vegas, there's a collective belief that more time, money, energy, et cetera, should be put into the strip area where all the casinos are, because that's what largely drives the town. But if you were to take that same kind of mentality and use it here in Albuquerque, where we were to take the Nob Hill area, for example, and try to turn it into a mini Las Vegas strip, a lot of people would not collectively believe that's how this city should operate. So what's worth achieving? What you should do for a living, right? So being a tech entrepreneur in Silicon Valley, California, is a life that is acceptable and should be lived. Whereas if you were living in a small community, farming potatoes, being a tech entrepreneur is not going to be the collective belief about what you should do for a living. Where do you live within the city? Who do you associate with? How do you interact with other people? So this is what Lewis is trying to explain back in the 50s as this idea of urbanism as a way of life, that living in the city produces a very specific sort of person. And so what he was trying to describe during this time is he's really trying to understand that urbanism, the cultural experience of living in the city, particularly the American city lifestyle, when he was writing about it, is extremely economically successful. Certainly when we talk about the wealth gap and the wealth that you can achieve here in America, the economic successfulness of the city or of the American city is something we tout time and time again. But Lewis is trying to understand that it's socially destructive, that when you move into a city, the process of urbanization, living your urbanism lifestyle, that what happens is when you become so focused on the way you live in cities, that it's socially destructive to a lot of other traditional social systems. And so urbanization, when we're talking about the city and how we describe it and how we would define it, what Lewis is trying to make sense of is that all these different components of urbanization have an effect on the person that lives within it. And so the size of the city, what is the population density, right? And so I've mentioned that here in Albuquerque, our city footprint is roughly about 6 square miles. Well, no, that's not right. My apologies. I'm getting my numbers mixed up. Anyway, what I was trying to say is that the exact square mileage of Albuquerque is also the exact same size as Seoul, South Korea. So when you're looking at the city and the city footprint, both Albuquerque and Seoul, South Korea are the exact same size. But Albuquerque, like we were talking about, if we're going off the 2010 census, only has a population of 1.1 million. Seoul has a population of 6 million on the exact same size of city. So when we're talking about the size of the city, we also need to consider the population density of that built environment. What are the variety of things and the diversity? And so what Lewis is trying to encapsulate is this idea that the larger things are, the more prevalent urbanism as a specific way of life becomes more prevalent. Now, what's really interesting is that this is not really the first time this has been described. So interestingly enough, here in the United States, we are predominantly a Christian nation. And so if you were looking for talking points, to family members who may be religious and follow the Bible as a way of life, and you're trying to relate your experience of urbanism and trying to kind of talk about what you're studying, well, one of the really interesting things is that within the Christian Bible, the creation and the destruction of cities is the most repeated story in the Bible. And so the Bible itself uses cities as a way of describing certain social practices reaching some sort of peak. And these practices are often in conflict with the Word of God. And so what happens is these cities are destroyed, and therefore with it, these social practices are destroyed as well. So the Bible itself actually uses cities to describe the collection of social practices, the rise of them, how they came to be, and also how they were destroyed, how God wanted these things wiped out. But what it also describes is the rebuilding of these cities. So when the Bible describes how one city is destroyed, it immediately jumps to the creation or the discussion of another city. So once you destroy one idea, the Bible immediately jumps into the creation of the correct idea or the new idea. And so each time the city is destroyed, it marks a specific end of those characteristics of that civilization. And then each time the city is rebuilt, it introduces a new physical pattern and social pattern of civilization. And so if you ever need a kind of an interesting, obscure talking point, to relate to other family members and what you do and what you study, this is definitely something in your favor. And so if we think about it this way, right, if we can even go back in time and take a look at stories in the Bible and city and compare and contrast social orders, we could take a look at what Wirth was trying to say in establishing this idea that urbanization creates a very specific way of life through urbanism. Then if we fast forward to today, kind of our modern Bible story, if we were to frame it that way, so to speak, is pretty much the dualistic nature between rural and urban. So the compare and contrast between these two different lifestyles, how one is better for certain reasons and why some people don't want to participate in others. And so this is typically how the dualism plays out. So if you are someone living in the city, the critique there is that the city represents complexity. And so that can discourage some people or maybe see certain cities as being kind of an evil place, right? So if we were to think about the complexity of what it is to drive in New York City traffic, that complexity may be so overwhelming for some people they don't even want to engage in it. The city represents constant change, innovation, but also disorganization. And meaning that even though there's a certain kind of clear rules or pattern to living in the city, it appears very disorganized, right? So take that famous intersection in Tokyo, Japan, which has a 5-way crosswalk. You've seen it in a lot of different movies where people, all of a sudden, a certain signal happens and people just flood into the street going many different directions. And while that appears to be very disorganized, there is a very distinct, constant pattern to it. The city also encourages variety and social novelty, and we'll talk about that one coming up here. And so if we were to flip over to the dualist comparison of this, the country, of course, represents the opposite, right? It represents simplicity, that simple, easygoing country living lifestyle. There's consistent rules, roles, and relationships, which forms traditions. So, the tradition of going to church on Sunday and the tradition of, going and getting a pie directly afterwards. There's a certain rule and a certain social order that you follow there. But there's also a kind of cultural conformity where certain relationships are and are not allowed. And so you have to keep things kind of under wraps, whereas the social novelty of the city allows you to kind of really be anybody you want to be. And so we'll dive into these last two more specifically here. And so if we were to take this idea of urbanism, what is the city itself? Usually the arguments that are made for urbanism, as discussed by Lewis, is that modern society destroys family and community bonds. And so typically when we're talking about the family, particularly here in the United States, we're thinking lots of kids, possibly many generations living under the same roof. And so if we're viewing that as the traditional family structure, a lot of people argue that the city and this culture of urbanism destroys these kind of typical societal norms and community bonds. Individuals more than ever feel isolated and alone in cities. And so we've certainly described this idea that If you were to move away, even though you live in a city where you don't really know anybody and you're constantly surrounded by people, that can be, ironically, feel very isolated. It does influence beliefs and has a huge effect on urban life. And so we'll touch on that one here in a minute. I'll save that. So sense of place, often marketed emotionally as warm, friendly, and a sense of community. So if you've ever moved or seen advertising for certain suburbs here in town, or the fact that right now in popular media, there's a very big conversation occurring about people leaving California and moving to places like Idaho and Texas. And so Texas is marketing the state as this, warm, friendly place where, you can leave that fake sense of California community and come to a place like Texas that offers that type of thing. And so this is contrasted as anonymous and isolated as part of this big city lifestyle. And so let's dive into this a little bit more distinctly. And so right now in America, we have this kind of very dualistic, off-putting thing in politics right now called Make America Great Again. And so if we were to use this idea, right, that is very prevalent in our everyday lives, let's borrow this conversation in order to kind of compare and contrast this idea of the social order of the city and the rule. And so there has been several people to also write about how destructive cities are. Now, Lewis was describing the social order of the city itself. He was not saying that urbanism as a way of life is good and bad. He was, as a sociologist, describing this relationship that he was seeing. But there was other people that very specifically saw the city as evil. And so let's kind of talk about a few of these folks. And the first one is Ferdinand Tönnies. And of course, I speak no German, so I have no idea how to correctly pronounce that last name. My apologies to Ferdinand. But he was a German sociologist, economist, and philosopher. And so if we were to boil down what his philosophy was, essentially what he was making the argument is that in a rural environment, community ties are based on personal relationships, which are the strongest and best relationships. And in an urban environment, you have only goal-oriented contractual relationships. And so these are a type of false relationship, which is why living in a city is socially destructive. And so an example of this, if you want to think about it a little bit more concretely, is that let's say you have a leak in your roof, right? And the job is a little bit too big for you to take on. Rather than calling your cousins, your uncles, your family members, people that you have actual community ties to because you have a personal relationship with them, rather than asking them to come over and help you fix your roof, you now hire a competitively marketed and priced roofing company, and you actually select which one to go with based on their price and the perceived value of what they're offering, rather than using family members and friends. And so what Ferdinand is saying here is that the social structure of the city itself, because our relationships are purely contract-based here in the city, they're not real and therefore not as strong. So again, someone else that we'll take a look at is Max Weber. He's one of the more popular German sociologists, philosophers. I'm not sure what a jurist is, and political economist. And so he also tackled the idea of the social structure of the city. And if you were to boil his argument down, basically what he was saying is that traditional society is based on spontaneous patterns. And so in a rural environment or in a rural community, the city is built and formed based on the actual needs of the city itself. And so if the city, for example, was a mining town, but now mining is no longer economically profitable, the city would, the smaller rural area would then have the ability to switch over to, say, farming or raising cows or something like that. And so they would spontaneously be able to adapt the city to the needs. And his counter argument is that in these urban environments, it is a rational society. We do have rules and laws that makes us feel comfortable, But what happens is all these formal rules and procedures really limits our ability to have any kind of spontaneous development, right? And so if you wake up one day and said, man, I would love just to turn the front part of my house into a coffee shop. You know, there's no coffee shops within walking distance of here whatsoever. And so I think there's a real business opportunity here, and I would like to do that. Well, to turn a residential home into a business requires rezoning, redistricting. It requires you to go through a lot of paperwork, follow certain rules and procedures, which most likely will result in you not being able to open up a coffee shop in the bottom part of your house. And so because of this, even though rational society feels very comfortable, it's very limiting and therefore is a negative impact on a person's social structure. And so an example of this one, of course, is bureaucracies where workers have formal job descriptions, rules and appointments, org charts for promotions, et cetera, right? So if you were working at the New Mexico Department of Health and one day you had this great idea to innovate some part of the job, you would have to then take that to your boss and then the boss's boss, et cetera, et cetera. And at any point, someone can squash your idea and it will never happen. Whereas if you were in a smaller rural area that encouraged this kind of spontaneous abilities, that's a more positive social structure. And the next one we'll take a look at is Emile Durkheim. He was the most popular French social theorist discussing this issue. And if you were to boil down kind of his arguments, what he was saying is that in the rural environment, there's a kind of mechanical solidarity, which the word mechanical and rule doesn't usually go hand in hand. But I mean, no, I won't make a joke about the French. My apologies. So one of his ideas was mechanical solidarity, which is that everyone has similar interests and follows the same social patterns. And so what he was saying is that in a small community, there's a certain kind of comfort because there's a certain kind of social structure. There's a clear social pattern about how you should live your life. And from the urban perspective, he was saying there's a type of organic solidarity where everyone is working towards the same thing, but as a division of labor. And so if you had to provide an example of what he was trying to say is he was saying that farmers all get up at the same time, plant and harvest at the same time with the seasons. Whereas the organs within a human body are all working together to keep someone alive, but yet they perform very clearly different functions. And so what he's trying to describe here is this idea that it's not really good or bad. He's just saying that there is two very differently organized social structures going on here. And so he's relating this to the idea that you can be an independent person, you can be a farmer, but yet there's kind of a very clear way that you have to operate within that, planting at certain times, harvesting at certain times. Whereas if you're thinking about more of an organic solidarity, is that the human body is working to keep you alive, and you can do anything you want, work any kind of job, go for a run, et cetera, but there's a certain function that's being performed in a very goal-oriented way. And so the last one we'll take a look at is Karl Marx. Of course, Marxism and everything else is one of the more popular social theorists. And so what Marx was into is he was another German philosopher, economist, and he was pretty much everything under the book: historian, sociologist, political theorist, journalist, social revolutionary, et cetera, et cetera. And so what he was trying to argue is predominantly the idea of work and the exploited, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And so if you were to take his central argument and kind of put it into this compare and contrast between the rural and the urban, what he was saying is that in a rural area, agrarian-based social orders, these kind of markets allow individuals to control their labor, control their goods and services, completely independent of rules put on you by a capitalist oppressor, right? So think of like a farmer's market, right? Is that these people have the ability to come together, they control what they grow, they control how much they sell their products for, and they have to price their products based on, of course, what it took to produce, and also compare it to their fellow person who is also competitively trying to price theirs as well. But that's a community choice, kind of the even of the market, rather than having someone up top like the Smith's grocery store controlling how much you have to sell your produce for. And if you were to flip the argument from the urban side, is that urban-based capitalism exploits workers that develops class consciousness, where workers unite via common class interests. And so think of it this way, is that if you needed the most modern example of Marxism, take eBay versus Walmart. And so at Walmart, you have a very clear structure of who is in charge of who, people telling other people what to do all up and down the chain. And there is no real kind of common class interest that they can unite around. There's really just the oppressors and the oppressed. But on eBay, you can take the exact same products they sell at Walmart and price them for whatever you want. And the price that you actually sell the product for is completely dependent on the market. Meaning that, if you have a really rare guitar from the 1960s and you put it up on eBay for $10,000, well, if you take a look on eBay, you search all around the internet and it's impossible to find that guitar for sale anywhere else, then sure, you're probably going to get $10,000 for it. But if you find another guitar from the 60s and put it up for sale, you're like, oh, well, this one sold for $10,000. I'll sell this other one for $10,000. You put it up on eBay, and of course, you search for that same guitar, and it turns out that other people that same guitar is already being sold by 50 other people, and they're selling theirs for $200. Well, the chances of you getting $10,000 for that guitar is basically completely non-existent. So the market itself has a way of controlling prices and actually controlling what people can make off certain products. And so if you want a very simple understanding of Marx, taking a look at the relationship between eBay and any other organization allows you to do that. And so let's make a quick callback here, right? So we just kind of went over some social theorists who were very much against, the city itself, at least on a social standing. And if you call back to the slide that we had in a couple lectures past, of course, our founding fathers of the United States here were influenced by such ideas and such writing. I mean, as we've talked about, Thomas Jefferson never intended the United States to become an urban area. And he actually specifically has referred to London as a dark satanic mill. And so when we take a look at why here in the United States, why we have this such dualistic opinion between the urban and the rural small community, it's even built into the founding documents of this country. And so there's a specific reason why we're taking a look at these things moving forward. And so to wrap up today, let's talk about some social characteristics of urbanism, and let's take a look at 3 social theories. Because as we take a look at some more concrete stuff, such as population size, urban economies, things of this nature, let's take a look at some of the social theory that is driving some of this stuff. And so the first one we're going to take a look at is determinist theory. And so the idea behind determinist theory is that urbanization will automatically produce a predetermined human social characteristics of urbanism as a way of life regardless of place. And so an example of this is if you were to, take you out of Albuquerque, New Mexico and drop you into another mid-sized city that operates very similarly, has a very similar population size, et cetera, that you can immediately jump into that way of life in that city, the practice of urbanism, because the process of the city, no matter what city it is, creates the same experience that you can navigate over and over. And so as an urbanite or somebody living in this system, you are a representative of the urban industrial society and not the city itself. And so when you introduce yourself, if you say, proudly say, well, I'm from Albuquerque, New Mexico, or I've lived in New York City my whole life, I'm a New Yorker. Well, according to determinist theory, that doesn't matter. because you're not actually an individual. You are simply a human being, a representative of the urban industrial society. It has nothing to do with the city you came from, because you can technically plop yourself down in any city and immediately know how that city operates. Urbanism increases tolerance for unpopular social ideas. And so if you subscribe to determinist theory, you believe that people who move into cities, because there's more people there, have the ability to become isolated and kind of really engage in unpopular social ideas. We'll talk a little bit more about those. While socially disorganized, urban life does not affect mental health. And so if you believe in determinist theory, you believe that the disorganization of the city, about the hustle and bustle, appears very disorganized, yet at the same time, this process does not affect your mental health at all. The urbanism is just a social experience and actually does not do any harm to you, your mental health. An organization has little effect regarding meaningful contact with others. And so when we compare the rural lifestyle, right, that because you know everyone in town, you know all your neighbors, you have a more meaningful social experience with them. But the fact is that in an urban environment and living under the lifestyle of urbanism, it actually doesn't have any effect on what you consider to be meaningful social relationships. So the second one we'll take a look at is compositional theory. And so if you believe in this kind of social theory, the idea is that the city allows not just one way of life, but rather a wide variety of lifestyles. And so whereas in a small city, you may just be the local barber and you're just kind of always going to be the local barber. But in the city, because it allows us to have a wide variety of lifestyles, right? I mean, you could cut hair by day, DJ by night, and drive Uber on weekends, right? And so it's not just one type of profession you're constrained by. It's a wide variety of lifestyles. And so regardless of how disorganized the social environment feels, groups of people coming together have shared morals and rules for behavior, even in high crime inner city neighborhoods. And so what they're trying to say here is if you subscribe to compositional theory, right, it's not that with determinist theory that because you come to a place, you immediately become associated with unpopular social ideas. But it's the idea that people coming together are going to have their own unspoken rules. They're already going to have certain morals. You can take the joke about hitmen, right? In 1970s movies, it's like, I'll kill anybody, but no women and kids. So that would be a compositional social theory, is that you have rules and morals even when you're doing something that may be considered immoral or sinister. And so regardless of these things, you can live that type of life. And then finally, regardless of size, density, etc. of the city, the social nature of an individual's community and social groups is most important. And so under compositional theory, even if you were to be here from Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is a mid-sized city, and relocate to the heart of Manhattan in New York City, it doesn't matter what size of city, how tightly packed people are in the city. Your social nature, the type of person you are and the type of people you want to associate with can be found in any size space. So the city itself does not dictate your social standing. And the last one we'll take a look at is subculture theory. And so if we're talking about the culture of urbanism, what it is to live in a city, subculture theory argues that space matters. Urban areas are shape human social life rather than destroying social groups, and actually intensifies subcultures. And so the easiest way to think about that is this, right? So when you have a city that has a really dense population, it allows members of a subculture to find each other and actually create a visible group. So an example of this is that in a city that has a lot of people, you can have a band that's nothing but tuba players. Whereas if you were just the lone tuba player, in the Los Lunas marching band in small rural America, I mean, you're probably going to be the only tuba player in the area until somebody else comes to school and picks up the tuba again. So you don't have the ability to form the all tuba band, right? And so subcultures can get way into the weeds, right? I mean, we can talk about stuff like model train enthusiasts, where all of a sudden you have model train clubs, whereas before you may not be able to have that. Any type of goth culture, small punk rock scene, people who have different sexual preferences. I mean, you can get all the way into the weeds on this one. And so subculture theory subscribes to the idea that living in a city does not destroy the social nature and your ability. It actually intensifies it, because now, no matter what you're into, you can find someone of similar mind. So if we kind of had to wrap up what we were talking about here, the thing that we really need to focus on is the idea that regardless of all this social theory, there are some distinct patterns we're aware of. And so prior to COVID, because of course now this has all shifted a little bit, is that if we really wanted to understand who was moving to cities and why they were moving to cities, when we took a look at the demographics of cities, the people living in them tended to be younger. They predominantly were female. Cities, of course, were more racially, ethnically, and religiously diverse, because, again, based off the social theories we just talked about, more people have the ability to come together. Economic factors were the biggest determination of where people lived in the city beyond race, ethnicity, and religion. And so your economic ability to actually support where you want to live has more impact on any compared to anything else. And then finally, cities with technology and a very distinct urban culture attracted more college grads than any other driver. And so one of the challenges that we have even in a place like New Mexico, here in Albuquerque, is that traditionally when people graduate from UNM, the vast majority are leaving for bigger cities where there is a very distinct urban culture or more readily available technology, right? Like, so if people want to move to a city that has 5G on their cell phone, that is actually one of the biggest things that attracts people. And so what happens, of course, is when you have people leaving in an area, they're not coming back into the city and actually using their college degrees to actually give back to the community and build the technological capacity here rather than going out and seeking it. So those were the urban populations that we were very much aware of. Of course, COVID has changed those things. So for closing circle today, the opening circle question that we asked is, what is a city? Well, based on what we just talked about, cities are places where a certain energy of people takes place. We really don't know how to necessarily always capture that energy. Certainly we apply terms like, New York, the city that never sleeps. Silicon Valley is a place that attracts tech entrepreneurs because there's a certain kind of entrepreneurial energy in that area. And so we typically describe cities as places where there's a certain type of energy taking place. Cities come in clusters. A city never exists without other cities in an urban system, right? So the whole time I was talking today, I was talking about not just Albuquerque, but its relationship to other cities and the direct compare and contrast, because cities will always come in clusters. You can never just talk about one as an isolated experience. Cities have physical boundaries. We talked about the footprint of Albuquerque and the comparison of the footprint to Seoul, South Korea, and how there's a distinct physical boundary there. Cities are places where specialized work occurs. So we kind of talked about the idea of being an entrepreneur, or if you're in a small town, a small city, kind of getting roped in if you're the local barber. It offers a very certain type of work. Wealth is not equal, and cities are both buildings and people. And so if you ever had to describe the idea of what is a city, those are the traditional things that we usually use to describe urbanism. All right, so that ends the conversational lecture for today. So looking ahead, coming up due this Sunday, remember the main focus of this week is to catch up on any late work that you have. If you fell behind on anything, there's only 2 short readings for the week. Because what's going to happen is we're going to switch gears, and the majority of the energy we're going to start putting into the classes towards our final projects. And so if you want to get caught up on late work, now is the time. All right, so now let's talk about building a final consensus towards the final exam. And so on Tuesday, we had a discussion about what we did not want the final in this class to be, and some ideas that we did want it to be. So clearly, we talked about how we do not want the final to be no video presentation, no memorize and regurgitate type of exam, you know, short essay, fill in the blank, multiple choice, etc. No kind of report. No long papers and no group projects. So we kind of collectively said we were not into that. But when we threw out the idea of what we do want to do for a final in this class, the ideas of some kind of visual presentation came up that should be more project-based. Maybe we can do some type of midterm style website. So maybe there's a web component that we build towards, and maybe we do some sort of case study. On Tuesday, I had sent out an email to the class letting folks know that if they wanted input on this, they could send that my way. Pretty much everyone that responded to me overwhelmingly agreed with the ideas that we had already talked about in class on Tuesday. And then the blue check marks just represent specific things that people said that they would like to do. And so since we're talking about this idea of the final, it seems overwhelmingly that people want to go in some sort of project direction. So let's go ahead and talk about that a little bit more now. I'm going to turn off the projector real quick. Bear with me. There we go. All right, so based on this idea of having a project, final project for this class, I'm going to throw out the idea of a design challenge. And what a design challenge is a project-based assignment or a project-based design. And what you do is you constrain yourself within a certain real-world wicked problem. And so what that means is that you actually take a real challenge facing our community and actually make an attempt to address it in some manner where you could actually make information available to others and actually legitimately try to solve a real problem. Just kind of like what we did at the midterm, where the knowledge that you put together within the first 8 weeks now lives for others to see on the website. Well, the idea of a design challenge is very much in that same line, where you can take the work that you're doing and rather than just working towards a final paper, working towards something that just goes in the trash at the end of the semester, it's something that people could actually possibly use. And so there's a couple different things that we can do here. And so when we're taking a look at the local area, I know when I get away from the microphone, you can't hear me, my apologies, that when we get too abstract, it can be really hard to put these projects together. And so the first idea I'm going to put out here is actually the city council funding. So the last election that we had a year ago, where voters actually got to vote on a variety of things, we actually approved certain money to be put aside for certain projects here in Albuquerque. So one thing that we could do to kind of constrain this project is that we could actually take a look at the money the city has actually approved for use and actually try to put together some suggestions and actually give them to the city about how they can actually, how we would like to propose that that money is used. There was lots of different bonds that were approved. One of them was for to address the homelessness challenge that we have here at Albuquerque. Another one I think was related to the gray water system. My mind is not memorizing all these at the time, I apologize. But that's one direction that we can certainly go. Another direction that we could certainly go is the idea of more of a grand challenge. So for example, so another thing that we could take a look at is the Gold King mine spill. And so for those of you that weren't familiar with this, a handful of years ago, we had, I can't remember the name of the mine. Man, my brain is not working well today, I apologize. We had a mine up in southern Colorado that actually broke loose when the EPA was doing some remedial work on the mine, and we had a bunch of nasty yellow acid mine drainage flood into the Animas River up in the Four Corners area. And when this toxic water actually, mining waste went into the water supply, it actually affected a ton of communities, Farmington and all the way into the Navajo Nation. And so the challenge with this is that this was not an isolated incident. There's actually over 7,000 abandoned mines in New Mexico alone. And so the same thing that happened with the Gold King mine spill could realistically happen again here in New Mexico, 10 years from now, next month. It could be happening right now. So this would also be another design challenge that we could take a look at. We could provide solutions for communities here in New Mexico that they could use should this happen to their community again. And then the other idea that we have is we could take a look at, what is that called? So for those of you that don't know, here at the University of New Mexico, we also have the Rainforest Building, which is closer to downtown on Central and Broadway. And the Rainforest Building, they have a program inside where it's actually an entrepreneurial-based program where you can actually, every year they have a pitch competition where you can put together some type of product or intervention, and you can actually make a 3-minute pitch. And if your pitch is selected, you'll actually get the money, seed money, to start funding your project itself. And so what we could do for this one is we could actually put together some pitches, some 3-minute pitches, to actually suggest a change here in Albuquerque that we could make within the city and actually use that money for those projects. And so there's a couple different ways that we could do this. So no matter which one we go with, and if you guys have any ideas for possible constraints projects, please use the chat or send me an email, whatever the case may be. But there's a couple different ways that we can present this as well. So this is just kind of the constraint of the project. What we could actually do, let's see here. We could do our research on these projects and we could make them publicly available on a web page. So we could just simply add another section onto our Clever Logo site that we already have. We could take whatever project we go with and actually publish our project onto the website that we already have. And so that's one idea. The other idea is that we could actually create, what is that, Shark Tank. So in the spirit of the rainforest pitch, of course, since we can't actually go down and make these pitches, and the class does have to end, so if we make a pitch, we don't want it to possibly be approved, and then next semester suddenly find yourself having to, actually do this thing that you're pitching. Huh? Yeah, so what we could do is we could actually do like a Shark Tank style, and we could put together our pitches also on a web page. So we could actually put our pitches together, put them on a web page, and we could actually present these to mock investors. And we could have the mock investors look all of your ideas over and actually select a winner in a Shark Tank style pitch. So what we could do is we could kind of come up with a final project structure based on the Shark Tank style. We could also go with the web page, or my last idea is we could do a mock community meeting. So when planners present their ideas, they don't just present them to other planners. They actually go out into the community and they actually pitch their changes that they would like to make to the city to the community members themselves. And so what we could do is, again, either using a web page or coming up with something else, some other website. What we could do is we could actually put together a mock community engagement site. And so what we could do is we could come up with an overarching picture, like let's say the Gold King mine spill, where we could actually put together a mock community meeting online, where if we were to go into one of these communities that was affected by a Gold King mine spill, or if you were to go into a community and actually present on how you would like to spend the city's bond money, then we could actually come up with a virtual community meeting, and that could be our final project as well. So those are the ideas that I've had based on this main idea of a design challenge. Looks like Lance says, would all of these projects have to be isolated to Albuquerque alone, or for those from other communities, could they use problems for their communities to orient their projects around? So that's a good question, Lance, because I know you're not currently in Albuquerque. So I will have to think about that one, because if we do go with the voter bond approved topic as an example for our design challenge, then what you might have to do is see if your city has passed any bonds or other city money, and you would have to frame your project around that. So use the chat, leave me any ideas that you have based on what I just went over. You got anything, Caleb? Any ideas coming off the top of your head?
Oh, no, like, we do like a community directive.
A community directive?
Yeah, like, put a plan together, I guess, that like improve the community developer. But that's probably like priority, I was more specialized.
No. I mean, we could definitely do that. So basically what we would do is with the money that's been put aside, is that would just basically constrain us to how much we could actually spend on any given project. And so, yeah, you could definitely put together a project about a change that you would actually specifically like to do for a community. It would just be constrained by how much money is available that the city has put aside.
Just specifically from that, not like, say, other grants also?
I mean, if you have knowledge of other grants, sure, we could do that as well. So that's a good idea. And so if we know of other grants that are out there, like the city block funding grants, things like that, we could use the money that's available around those other grants to actually frame our project. Grants usually want some sort of specific result, and so we would just have to see what that grant is looking for as a way of framing the project. So yeah, that's another idea as well. Let's see here, Solana, I like all these ideas, more so the mock community meeting for bonds. Okay. What did you call yours? Community?
Oh, like community directive.
What do you say, like directive or something like that?
Directive, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, this is that.
So whatever the project is that we design, it has a more specific community focus. So the directive or the project that we design as part of this design challenge is more specifically focused on the community itself. So anyone else that's out there, do you have any ideas? Do you agree with any of these things that we would like to see us move forward on? Please use the chat and let me know. We've got a few more minutes here, so we'll just spend a few more minutes digesting this. Hopefully you guys can hear me okay today since I'm wearing the mask, which is a little bit different from Tuesday. So hopefully that still worked out okay. All right, so I'll just give another minute here. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Aaron likes the community directive take. All right. So there's kind of two things to think about on the board, right? Is that the design challenge itself, what is the focus of the project, and then what is the final product that we actually produce? Do we just make a web page that people can search for and access? Do we put together pitches? Possibly either, we limit the word count to say a 600-word proposal, or a 3-minute video or something along those lines, and then we actually have a mini competition where the best project is selected by mock community members. We could actually, the final could actually be like a Zoom where you actually have to pitch to the actual people, or we could just have them, review your videos and or your web pages, and then just select the winner that way, so we can get either more competition or just presentation style. Or we could actually do a mock community meeting where you took your idea and you're actually writing and coming up with maps, diagrams, and designs that the actual community could use. And so that's very specific because we'll be looking at a very specific kind of community directive. And so we would be writing for this audience specifically, which means that if we go in this direction, then we kind of have to have a main central project, and all of us would play a different role in that project. Well, I don't see anything popping up in the chat, so let's take some time to digest this. So I'm going to post this picture to our website and send it out after class today. So that way people can think it over the weekend. And then on Tuesday, probably what I will do is over the weekend is I'll put together either a Google Forms or a survey, and then we'll actually have people vote on this, and then we'll kind of announce the winners of the design challenge, and then we'll kind of take it from there. Oh, you know what? Actually, I want to make sure that I give people the option to actually suggest things for the design challenge. So what I'll actually do is this: is over the weekend I will send you out a survey that has these options that we've talked about so far, and then I will put a space in there for you to make other suggestions. And then on Tuesday, then we'll put all that together. I'll send out the survey for voting, and then we'll have a final decision on Thursday. So that makes more sense, so that way people can actually make. Aaron says webpage may be best for presentations. Yeah, no problem, we can do that. So for presentations, there's lots of different ways, right? You don't have to record a video of your face talking, right? I mean, you can do a narrated PowerPoint. PowerPoint has the ability for you to record your voice and just talk over slides and then export it as a video. And so if we go in whatever direction we go in, there's lots of options. So even if we do the pitch for a 3-minute video, you don't have to be on video. It can be just your voice and pictures and you making your pitch. And so and that one will have a winner winner. So whatever your project is, it just gets bragging rights rather than actually funding your project, of course. All right, so I guess that's it for today. So I will send all of this out, and you guys can then decide where we want to move, and we'll do some final voting on Thursday and get our final ideas together by Tuesday. Again, use this time to get caught up if you're late on anything, and other than that, I will talk to you all on Tuesday. Thanks again.